Let's begin with a thought and a feeling that brings us into the present moment, which right now is more important than anything we could possibly be talking about or thinking about. It's really just being in the present moment that is so important right now. So to honor that, I just want to give massive amount of thanks for all the things that we take for granted, the air that we breathe, the ground that we stand on, the food that we eat, the people who come into our lives, and we have the opportunity to be in other people's lives. Anything that really just reminds us of how humble our existence really is. That's really what I want to start off with this video today. And the thing that motivated me to want to share something today is this idea of the Matrix and how the Matrix is a real story, a real experience. It's not simply just a science fiction movie. It's more like a science faction movie. The thing that strikes me as important to discuss right now, especially, is this idea how the Matrix and the mythology and the philosophy behind this movie and this saga directly relates and reflects to Gnosticism and this deeper mystical understanding that we are in a simulation. The simulation idea gets kind of lost and convoluted, I think, with computers as we think of it today. And that's important because that gives us context and a frame of reference to really describe what we're talking about when it means to be describing a simulation. But it's more than just like a computer. Just think back to a world where there weren't computers to give us this reflection, this technology that allowed us to see things in this way. Before there were computers, the simulation still was a real thing. This is what Gnosticism really is all about. And there's so much deep, esoteric, philosophical truth that comes from this spiritual practice of Gnosticism. Gnosticism spelled Gnosis, gnosis. And this is a Greek word that means knowledge, but it's a different kind of knowledge than what you would think of as like reading a book or gathering information. It's more than just information you download. It's more of an inner knowing, more directly connects to wisdom as opposed to knowledge. So it's this really important thing that the real answers lie within, and the truth that allows us to experience life is something that's within you, and no outside force is really gonna tell you what the real world is. The only way you can know what the real world is if you get down into yourself, into your deep and understanding of the inner self. So this is, and again, from the movie The Matrix, the idea of knowing thyself. If you know yourself, then you'll have a better sense of what others can mean, or even just your environment can mean. You can learn a lot about your environment by learning about yourself. And this is one of the most challenging things I think we've had to embrace for our current situation. Is this idea of reflecting and knowing ourselves. We're always focused outward so much so that we, as like a default defense mechanism, distract ourselves constantly away from the truth, which is within ourselves. And there's so much interesting stuff about Gnosticism that I would love to get into. I would like to focus on this idea of the Demiurge. The Demiurge is kind of like your ego, but it's like a great collective ego within the simulation. It's this force that is a creating force of what we perceive as the material world. Now, of course, it's not really a material world. When you understand the Matrix and understand quantum physics, everything is energy. So the world and the illusion of the Matrix is that it seems physical. Then there seems to be separateness between this object and that object, me and you. Your inner world and your outer world, but these are all interconnected, and that's the illusion. The Demiurge is a force that is very old, and it really is defining as this what we would perceive as God almost. And this is like one of the really interesting things about Gnosticism is that the Demiurge is the devil and God at the same time. There's an interesting saying that you've probably heard before, how the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince you that he didn't exist. But Graham Hancock, one of my favorite all-time researchers and idols in esoteric teachings and ancient civilizations and everything, he actually evolved this statement and says, well, maybe it's a little bit more fucked up than that, to be honest. Instead of the greatest trick the devil ever played to convince you that he didn't exist, what if the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince you that he was God? This is what builds up to this idea of a demiurge. This idea that we have this being that we consider to be the almighty, all-powerful creator of the universe, and we worship it. All the major religions, especially the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, granted they all have really important truths in their origin story that teach us a lot about our relationship to ourself and the environment, this like key thing of knowing thyself and community and relationship to nature. But they've all been corrupted. And each one of these religions ultimately is talking about the same exact God. This God, the Lord, the Father in the sky. This idea of the guy in the clouds that's controlling everything. Even in the Sistine Chapel with the God and Adam with the two fingers touching, like that idea of God creating world, that's the demiurge. And Gnostics actually have a really radical way of seeing this. This is important for Gnostic traditions, is to recognize that this being that we deify and has been exalted as a god and a creator is not actually God per se. When people are in these religions, oftentimes they're in the euphoric state and believing in like God. And that is true. There is a God. It's kind of like in Star Wars, there's the Force. It's just this ever-present force that binds the universe together, and it's like the conscious creative field as a whole. So like when people are talking about God, a lot of times that's what they're referring to, but without understanding the language and the barriers and the programming that all of these religions have had a major role in deceiving us for so long, and for good purpose and not so good purpose, and we can get into more of the meaning behind whether or not this is good and bad. That's irrelevant right now. The idea here is to recognize that Gnostics, myself included, see that this being who we perceive and worship as God, the creator, which oftentimes is a masculine force, is what we call the demiurge. It's actually more like a demonic being. And this is what like Graham Hancock was saying. It's like, what if the devil, greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince you that he was God? So what you have to understand here, when we talk about the matrix and we talk about the demiurge and we talk about the programming in our culture that's been going on for so many thousands of years, we're talking about a being that has been masquerading as God, that has been demanding obedience and worship to. This is completely antithetical to what Gnostic wisdom and philosophy and practice is all about, because the God is not out there. Anything that comes and says you need to worship me in order to have this higher power that's outside yourself, that's not true. The real God is within you, which connects you to like a prism, like light through all of these halls of mirrors that each person on the earth is kind of like one of these mirrors, and we're all reflecting this higher purpose of God that no one can really see on their own. You have to go within. So anything that masquerades as this force, that's the demiurge. And it's manifesting in such profound ways today on the earth and what we're dealing with right now that it kind of blows my mind. These things, like we said before, have been around for thousands of years, even before there were computers and simulation theory and all that stuff. The idea of a simulation, that we're living in a prison of our beliefs and that there's some sort of demonic force that has been keeping us down, like a demonic entity. A lot of religious zealot kind of people would say like, oh, Satan's out there trying to deceive you at every turn. This is an ancient mystical understanding and symbol, but we always kind of get too caught up in the identity of this from the perspective of each different religion and good versus evil. But when you recognize that one of the key plot point spoiler alerts here is that God that is part of the three Abrahamic religions is actually the demonic force that's been keeping you imprisoned in this world. That is the real, like, one of the major breakthroughs we need to recognize right now. And the world with AI and social media, the algorithms, the technology that is permeating, that's so interconnected with like human relationships, and almost like the technology is getting so far beyond our understanding that it's taking on a life of its own. Like, this is the beginning of what we would consider to be artificial reality or artificial intelligence. And it's concerning because we have to remember what we're dealing with here. It comes down to this very much, very simply, is that the truth is within you. You are a conscious creative being living in a field of energy, and that everything that you see outside of you is just a reflection of something that is occurring internally within yourself. And every single person has an opportunity to go down this hero's journey, so to speak, to discover what that means for themselves. And the Demiurge is kind of like that troll under the toll, taking your tolls, that's keeping you from going on that journey. Anytime you kind of come to a revelation, that thing's going to stop you, make you second guess yourself. Now, you'll never really know. That's the paradox here, is you'll never really know. And you have to remain open to the mystery of life. That's where the real gnosis comes in, is that you recognize the one most important fundamental piece of knowledge, gnosis, that there is that we don't really know. And that seems counterintuitive, but that is the mystery of life, is that we are living in this world of a simulation of our five senses. We can only perceive a certain amount of vibrational frequencies through our eyes, our sense of touch, our nose, and our hearing and taste. And like these are very limited doors that we allow that frequencies can come in that we can perceive of. But there is so much more than that. And when we learn to break free of that and to just recognize that the truth is not out there, the truth is within yourself. The Demiurge is a really mangly beast that we have to deal with. And if use that word too, the beast, the mark of the beast, the AI and the transhumanism, merging humans with machines. See, the thing is that in a way, it's part of a natural progression of human beings to evolve past our five senses, but it has been co-opted and hijacked by this demonic. I don't like to use the word demonic, but it essentially is like a demonic force, which is the Demiurge. This is something that has been around for tens of thousands of years and is really the guiding force behind all of the horrible things that we see on the planet right now. And you can see this in the Bible, which I don't like to talk about too much, but how in the Old Testament, the God there is much different than the God in like the New Testament, okay? In like the Christian version of the Bible. Because the Old Testament God is more like the Demiurge in that sense. It's a very vengeful, kind of oppressive, do as I say, not as I do kind of presence, versus the omnipotent love and compassion and altruism that comes from like later versions of this story. So there's a lot of really interesting things to unpack here, but I think the most important thing that we need to recognize is that we have all of the truth and wisdom within ourselves, and we don't need to be subjected to outside forces trying to sway us. We need to be very mindful of our surroundings because that Demiurge manifests in so many different ways. In the movie The Matrix, this is a really good visual to think about. In the movie The Matrix is the image of any person that's not unplugged from the system can be immediately hacked by the Matrix, the Demiurge, and an agent can just appear out of anywhere. See, the thing is we're operating so limited in our perception, and we are so easily manipulated because of the amount of information. We're not really in the present moment as much, which makes us more subjected to manipulation. So when we get down into this idea of the truth is within, you don't need to accept that. Just it's really important and more now than ever to be mindful of yourself, your thoughts, your feelings, and to really cultivate those. Learn to listen to them. Don't push them away. And recognize that most of the thoughts and feelings that we have are just programs. They're programs running on a loop until we learn to listen to them and stop the program to create a new one. This is a deprogramming process, and for most people, including myself, anyone that's in the world today, it's just like if we could just turn off the noise for long enough to allow the unfolding and the unwinding to release all of these programs, and we can actually be for a second. Now, last thing I'll say is this. There are a lot of technologies and methods to get into the present moment, to recognize this programming of the, to get out of this assimilation with this demiurge, because that's really the problem I think we're talking about here is like we're starting to almost convince ourselves that this thing is us and that this is the natural progression when it's not. So the two technologies that I want to leave you with, number one, are float tanks. If you can get into a float tank and really just be in complete sensory deprived state where it's dark, there's no sound, and you're floating in this water, like saltwater solution, all sense of boundaries go away. And it really accelerates something like what you would normally may take hours and days and a very long time to get into a meditative state, just sitting there on your carpet. When you get into a float tank, it just accelerates that whole process, and it just separates you back into what it is that you really are, where you can just be. And that's where the true gnosis comes out. So right now, it's really important to do something like a float tank and even just meditate. Even if you can't meditate, just stop, take a breath. Breathing is the most fundamental, primordial way in technology of getting into the present moment and to release these looping programs that have been programmed onto us by what I'm telling you right now is the demiurge. There's a lot of really interesting information about all the symbology behind why and how this is and how old it is and how it totally applies to right now more than ever. So we have a great opportunity to really learn from our experiences, but what I'm asking to do right now is to just be quiet, get quiet, close your eyes, and breathe. This is so important because then once we do that, then the programming will start to fade away, and then we can start to really see who we are and where we want to be, which is actually right where we need to be all the time. We don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. It's already here, currently, presently, omnisciently available, and it's not something that you have to really study for. Just if you can breathe, you can do this. So remember, take it or leave it. But the key thing to remember here is that when you're presented with this choice of what do I do, maybe we've done enough.